Catholic bioethics. One definition of bioethics is what may be done out of what can be done in science and technology today. You know, can and may are not just, it's not just a grammatical distinction, it can be a distinction between life and death for certain people. Can and may, we can do it. But should we do it? May we do it, right? And of course, what drives this field many times is technology, because technology empowers us when it works. But then the question is, should we do it? Should we edit the human genome that is a patrimony of humanity, for example, all right? Or should we grow human brains in pigs, as was proposed by the NIH just a couple of years ago? So I'm going to focus on three areas today. First, a Judeo-Christian theological anthropology, because we have to ground our arguments somewhere. And then a snippet of contemporary Catholic bioethics, the two main areas of discussion. And finally, just a reminder that we're not alone in this sacred task of engaging in bioethics. So a Judeo-Christian theological anthropology, which can be traced at least for 2,000 years, and if we interpret the Old Testament through the eyes of the New Testament, we can add another 2,000 years of that to Northwestern culture. Four aspects of a theological anthropology, a Judeo-Christian theological anthropology: biblical, theological, philosophical, and biological. By the way, this little presentation I'd be happy to send to anyone who wants it. My email will appear there in red throughout the slides, and I think it's also being taped, recorded, so if anyone wants this, I'd be happy to share it. Biblical. In the Old Testament, 46 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. So we have, there's always two authorships for the sacred scripture. There are 46 human authors in the Old Testament, but one divine author. And that's a good thing, because there are 27 human authors for the New Testament, but only one divine author, and it's the same one as the Old Testament author, okay? So that allows for continuity of the message and integrity in spite of what the human authors may or may not have written down. But just from the first book of the Old Testament, which is also the first book of the Torah, the first chapter, as we know, that beautiful, eloquent story of creation, the narrative of creation, which, by the way, parallels an evolutionary narrative of the origin of the universe and earth and life and human life. Toward the end of that first chapter, as we all know, is a good Lord saves the best for last. He creates us in his image, in his divine image and likeness, male and female. And you notice no other. There's no trans alternative, there's male and female, okay? God keeps it simple. All right, then there is a deepening of that image of God in the New Testament. If we take the beginning of each one of the four Gospels, which, as you know, are the ones that speak to us more directly about the life of Jesus, it turns out we're not only created in God's image, we are actually created in the image of Christ. So now we have an incarnate God. And it turns out that God becomes a human being. Folly. That the Creator would become a creature. You know, in one of the three monotheistic religions of the world, to say that God becomes a human being or that God has a son is blasphemous. It's just about the most harsh insults that you can do to God, and it deserves punishment, it deserves death. And that is a point that is essentially irreconcilable, because it is the core of our Christian belief, that God, out of this folly love that he has for us, has become a human being and has shown us in that the way, the truth, and the life. is what is known as the kenotic passage. Kenosis is the pouring out. He pours himself into our humanity so that we may pour ourselves into his divinity. And it's like a U shape. He comes down into us and then goes back up, picking us up to eternal life, because God's image is eternal, and that is ultimately our destiny, that is our belief. Much more to say about that, but there's always no time. So I'm going to move on to the theological grounding of a Judeo-Christian anthropology and this dignity and sanctity of human life, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. So ontogenetically, with regards to our individual origin, from conception to natural death, but also phylogenetically, in other words, as a species, as a whole. When do we start? These first humans that we call Adam and Eve, which, by the way, Adama means man in Hebrew, okay, and Ewa, Eve, is of man. In fact, in English, woman, in Old English, W-O is of, right? Woman. Bespeaks of the creation of this complementarity, this natural complementarity that God does in the human male and female, but phylogenetically also. And, we have to be honest and true with the facts, with the evidence. And there is a fossil record that we cannot deny. Thanks be to God, as Catholics, we're not fundamentalists, so we don't interpret the Bible literally. We look at the sensus plenior. Sensus plenior is the fuller meaning of the passage. Moving forward then philosophically, I never knew this until I was working on my first doctorate at the Gregorian in Rome. And it turns out that the root word, the etymology of person, which is not univocal, right? But the etymology of person is from the Greek prosopon. And prosopon is the mask in Greek. It comes from classical Greek theater, where the mask both reveals and conceals. You've all seen those photographs, maybe you've been there, of the amphitheater, the classical Greek amphitheater, by the way, no microphones. So that actor had to project his voice. And the amphitheater was also designed so as to project voice in an open air environment. Someone told me one time that these typically were men, was a single actor, and he would practice at the shore, at the seashore. In the Mediterranean, the beaches are mostly pebbles, all right? And he would put pebbles in his mouth and practice his lines, speaking with those pebbles in his mouth out toward the Aegean Sea. All right, and that's how they build some kind of voice stamina. At any rate, in the original Greek theater, there would be a table and the actor behind the table, and then the audience in the amphitheater itself. On the table would be several masks, and each mask represented typically a god or a hero or a human, because it was all about Greek mythology. And so the actor would take a mask and portray Zeus, and then put that mask down, and then pick up Jupiter. No, that's from Rome. Mercury, or one of the other gods. And it was the mask that revealed the protagonist, but concealed the actor. So prosopod, really person, is very rich, because simultaneously reveals and conceals. And it really does summarize to the face, the human face, the countenance. In the animal world, we have one of the most, if not the most expressive face in the animal kingdom. Simultaneously revealing and concealing sentiments, feelings, what we're thinking, right? Only two people really know what we're thinking at any one time, ourselves and God. But we can reveal many emotions also, and sentiments and so forth. So from this perspective, for example, the unborn is the perfect person because both reveals a developing humanity and conceals that very same humanity as human, belonging to the human species. because the DNA is expressing very fast within 9 months to grow 5,000 times the original size in those 9 months. At any rate, consider prosopon. It was an illumination for me when I discovered the etymology of it. Finally, on the biological side, this issue that life begins at fertilization is a no-brainer. I mean, this is a universal phenomenon for all species that reproduce sexually, including plants. In any high school biology textbook, if that textbook is honest and has integrity, you'll see that even plants, the pollen pollinates a flower. The pollen grain actually contains 2 sperm cells and fertilizes an egg. And the result of that fertilization is a zygote, which is universal for all species, like I say, that reproduce sexually, plants and animals. All of a sudden, when we come to the human, we don't know. Maybe these folks missed that lecture in their high school biology class. They were absent that day. Or maybe it wasn't given to them, they should get a refund. But the point is, yeah, because this is a universal phenomenon that whether we believe it or not, whether we like it or not, it's out there, all right? These are the facts. The end of life, when vital organs fail irreversibly. And this also helps to determine when life actually ends, so that with increasing biomedical technology, it's a fine line between extending life or extending death, right? But one crucial difference here is the distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs. Assisting vital organs obligates morally, but substituting vital organs does not obligate morally. I'll talk a little bit more about that if there's time later. Another principle that I like very much in nature, form follows function. Form follows function. Now, here, on behalf of fellow scientists, I have to ask forgiveness for confusing form with shape, because typically empirical scientists are not philosophers, even though they have a PhD, and that's kind of a quandary, right? But they don't know how to do philosophy, and they actually think that philosophy is an opinion. Yeah, and theology, it's an even worse opinion. But philosophically, there's a distinction between form and shape, right? Because there are many shapes of humans in here. Maybe we're 40, 50 humans in here today, this morning, and there are as many shapes as there are individuals in here. But we're all one form. We're a human form. At any rate, so shape follows function, meaning that the structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing. If the arm needs to bend, you better have a hinge somewhere along the way so it can bend, and so on and so forth. Well, fine. Then if we apply that to the sexual organs, there is also a natural complementarity to them, and they belong in certain places and don't belong in other places. Form follows function. So we can develop an argument of bioethics from nature without having to mention God, faith, or religion. Okay? Nature tells us if we're humble enough to observe nature and come to some conclusions. Okay, the second aspect then is contemporary Catholic bioethics. I call it job security because not a week goes by, right, without a new issue coming up. So contemporary bioethics can be divided into 2 main areas, which are rather intuitive: human life issues and environmental issues. And within the human life issues, again, the hot points, the beginning of life issues, end of life, and then in the middle of life also, mostly with healthcare. Okay? So these are the main areas of bioethics today, and as Catholics, we are privileged, precisely because we don't interpret the Bible literally, and because we accept the argument from nature. In fact, in moral theology, we use natural law, all right? Then we can engage, and I'm thinking perhaps we're one of the few religions that can actually engage the scientific community in a dialogue, if they're interested, of what may be done out of what can be done in science and technology today. Well, finally then, just a reminder that we're not alone in this sacred task, okay? Now, the photographs here are the representative of these 4 areas of bioethics. This is in vitro fertilization. This is a sperm that is being inserted into an egg, and this process totally bypasses the natural process of fertilization. Now, we understand biologically it only takes 1 sperm to fertilize 1 egg of whatever species, including the human. However, for a human ejaculate to be considered potent clinically, must contain anywhere between 100 to 150 million sperm. And that's what we call natural selection. So the selective pressure against human sperm is about 100 million to 1. Okay? It is staggering. And that's why, on average, it will be the healthiest, strongest, most potent, capacitated sperm that will fertilize that egg. And the resulting will be the strongest, most vigorous human embryo product of that fertilization. It's natural selection. We have nothing to do with it. So in vitro fertilization bypasses totally by a technician in the lab washing the sperm and then selecting under a light microscope what he or she thinks is the strongest sperm, capacitated, maybe because it has a tail, and inserting that into an egg, totally bypassing. And that's an injustice. We have denied that embryo to be the strongest, most vigorous possible human being that she or he can be. It's a fundamental denial of natural selection at the individual level. Not to mention that it does weaken the human species one way or another, because then that weaker individual, perhaps, goes into the gene pool, right? Goes into the human population. So these are the underlying issues. At the end of life, well, this is just a photograph of the website of Compassion and Choices, which is the strongest ideological group pushing for the legalization of physician-assisted suicide in the United States. And by the way, already 8 states of the Union have legalized physician-assisted suicide. That's more than 10%, it's about 12, 15% of the Union has already legalized by the states physician-assisted suicide. And that number, predictably, is not going to diminish, right? Right now, there is about anywhere between 2 and 3 dozen states in the Union that have physician-assisted suicide working through different legislative committees at the state level, including Florida. What saves us, of course, thanks be to God, if there was a silver lining, is Terri Schiavo. That no politician wants to touch it because, ironically, it's political suicide, right? But yes, that case so marked our state that no state legislator wants to be an advocate for this, but the groups are there pushing it very strongly. On the middle of life, transgenderism, this is the front cover of National Geographic, January of last year. National Geographic has now identified 15 different genders for the human species. But they really fell short because the UN has identified about 30 different genders. And of course, this is not without its bite, because some committees in the UN are beginning to withhold aid to certain countries in the developing world unless they go into the gender agenda. They abide by the gender agenda. Okay, so it's very real, very political. Finally, this is just a photograph of the world, of our Earth, our planet Earth, which looks so beautiful between the blue, the white, and the green. When you look at photographs of other planets, they don't look that hospitable, just by the eye. And I want to point out that we are integrating environmental bioethics in our Catholic teaching, even highlighted by the first encyclical in the history of the Catholic Church by Pope Francis, Laudato Si, of 3 years ago now. You can download it for free in whatever language you want, but I highly recommend it. So I want to point out that if it is a sacred task, again, the root word sacramentum from Latin is translated into mysterion in Greek, meaning that truly our life is a mystery. This quote, which variably is attributed to either to Nietzsche or to Kierkegaard. I prefer it to be from Kierkegaard, but at any rate, there was an epitaph for Nietzsche. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It says, God is dead, Nietzsche. Nietzsche is dead, God. Nice. He had a sense of humor. So life is not a problem to be fixed, okay, but a mystery to be lived. Just by looking at this black and white photo of two hands, it tells us a lot. By looking at those two hands, it reveals and conceals a lot. But ultimately, we're called to enter into the mystery of human life until the Lord calls us to the mystery of eternity. Thank you very much.
Sorry to have to start your morning hearing from an attorney. Probably not what you really want. So we'll try and make it as lively and interesting as possible. So I'm with Alliance Defending Freedom. We are a nonprofit Christian law firm that exists to keep the door open for the spread of the gospel. And a lot of what we are finding ourselves engaging in lately is dealing with licensed professionals like yourself. We're seeing more and more that the front line in the battle for religious liberty in America is happening in your profession, especially. That it's becoming more and more that in terms of pushing a ideology on our country, an ideology that is very anti-God, as we were just hearing, and anti-religion, that they're seeing that they want to do it through you guys. You are the opinion makers. You are the shapers of culture and of thought and identity and so many things. And so they're wanting to sort of force you to bow down to this new ideology. And they're doing it largely through a couple of different vehicles that I want to explore this morning with you all. The first one is through these non-discrimination laws. Now, we may look at these and say, these sound like very good things. These are laws that have been in the books for many years at the federal level, at the state level, banning discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations based on race, age, sex, religion, various categories like that. Now, these grew from a very laudable goal, right? We had problems in our history specifically with discrimination based on race and based on sex and these other characteristics where society-wide, you couldn't go to certain restaurants and sit at the lunch counter based upon the color of your skin. Or there were certain professions that were completely off limits to you. There was a day where if a young woman said, I want to go into the medical field, I want to be a doctor, the professors would say, oh, that's nice, little lady, but doctors are for men and nurses are for women, right? And so there was these artificial barriers placed on individuals based upon immutable characteristics. So our legislators step in and say, look, we want to break those down. We don't think that's fair. We don't think that's right. So in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they started passing these at the federal level and at the state level as well. And largely these have been very good, right? Have created more opportunities and more equality without regard to a person's immutable characteristics. The problem is within the last, let's say 10, 15 years, there have been efforts to change these laws and to just add a couple of simple phrases, a couple of simple words to them, but that radically reshape what these laws do. And what they've done is to add sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of protected classifications. So you go from these characteristics that are, race, age, things like that are unchangeable, right? As much of us as some of us might like, we can't change the color of our skin. We can't change our biological reality. We can't change how old we are. But they started adding these very fluid, changeable classifications to the law that really had sweeping implications. So, for example, you have situations where, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but you've probably heard some of the cases with the bakers and the florist and things like that, right? So these are individuals that all say, anybody that walks into my store, anybody that walks into my shop, I will gladly serve. But if you asked me to, say, photograph a same-sex wedding, well, that violates my conscience, right? I've got a certain view of what marriage is, that it's a very sacred union between a man and a woman. And for me to participate in that, to use my talents to sort of affirm and celebrate that would violate my beliefs. Well, these laws come in and say, well, that's discrimination. To which the photographer replies, not at all. If they want a family photo shoot or something like that, I'm happy to do. But when you ask me to step into a particular ceremony that has very deep, significant religious meaning to me and become a participant in that, that's not about discrimination, right? That's about my freedom of speech, my freedom of religion bumping up against their request. But again, these laws don't allow those sort of subtleties. They just say, well, you're a bigot and you're discriminating based upon sexual orientation and you lose. And that's unfortunately what we've seen happen in several instances. And so we did have a young woman in New Mexico that had that exact scenario pop up, Elaine Huguenin, and politely declined, said, I would be happy to refer you to another photographer, but that wasn't enough. And ultimately she was convicted under one of these non-discrimination laws. But these laws aren't just limited, and these ideas are not just limited to the legal sphere and to sort of how society as a whole is governed. We're actually starting to see these policies work their way into various professions and their codes of conduct. And so, for example, the American Medical Association, the American Counseling Association, I think APA and so many others, have said as a condition of you being a member of our organization, you must also agree to these non-discrimination policies. Now, again, most of us would probably say, I have no problem with that. And I can say that even as an attorney. If I was opened my own firm, was doing, real estate law, something like that, I don't care who comes into my law firm. I'm going to serve them. I'm going to help them with a real estate transaction. But you can start to see in any profession that there may be lines because of our religious convictions that we may not be able to cross. So, for example, I was talking with a fellow attorney that does adoption law. And the question came up, well, what if a same-sex couple comes in and asks me to help them facilitate their adoption? This person was saying, I don't know if I would feel comfortable with that. And traditionally, the professions have been set up to say that's okay. That in those situations, you as a licensed professional have a right to step aside and say, you know what, I may not be the best person for this. I think you ought to find someone else that would be glad to help you pursue those goals. And the same thing is true in the counseling profession, in the medical profession, and so many others, that there's always been a respect for the freedom of your conscience. And to be able to say, look, I'm not comfortable with this specific request. I may not be the best person to help you. And to just be able to very politely say, let me see if I can help you find someone else. But more and more, this is becoming where this is not allowed even under the professional codes of conduct of various organizations. And so they're coming in and saying, you no longer have the freedom to refer. You no longer have the freedom to operate your clinic, to operate your profession consistent with your religious convictions. This is what you must do. And for you to evoke conscience and to say, I'm not sure I can cross that line, is a violation of these codes of ethics and can bring you up on charges and ultimately expulsion from these various associations. And this is the problem with these laws, with these policies and things like that. See, I want to give you a little bit of a framework to view what's going on with all of these. So I always like to view it in the context. Think of sort of like a dartboard, right? So you've got the various levels, the targets going to the highest points in the center. And when you look at this ideology that's going on of sort of embracing and celebrating a non-biblical view when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, for many, many years, the battle was largely fought in the culture. And this was very intentional, right? And so the idea was, we want to shape American society and to take these beliefs and this ideology that was very much on the fringe and make it the mainstream. And so they went after Hollywood and they went after TV. And so you started seeing the movies change and television change. And, I'm still pretty young, but I still remember, it's funny how everything comes around again. The Roseanne show many, many years ago, and they had sort of the first openly gay person and all of this going on. And then now here we are, sort of the revival of the show and all of that. And the Ellen show. And then we had, Will and Grace, and so many of the others in culture that were sort of normalizing this ideology. And it was a very intentional thing. And if you read some of the creators of these shows, they said, look, if you want to normalize same-sex behavior and even same-sex marriage, you got to get where people relate and laugh about it. And so they were very successful in all of this, right? And so where it gets more and more where it's now, they cry out if a movie doesn't include an LGBT character, rather than saying, shouldn't we just be focused on having good, interesting characters regardless? Why does sexual orientation always have to come up? And we're now seeing the same thing with the gender ideology, right? Is that this push to say, oh, you've got to have trans characters in movies and sort of celebrate those characters as this is going on. But this is not the end of the battle. No, in fact, it's just the beginning, because from the attack on culture comes the attack on vocation, right? Okay, so we've now conquered culture, and we've gotten where culture embraces and celebrates these ideas of sexual orientation, gender identity. Well, it's not just enough for culture to do it. We need to require our vocations, our professions, our callings to embrace those. And so that's where we're seeing these policies come up with more and more professional organizations saying, if you want to be a member of our organization, you must embrace this ideology and this beliefs. But then it goes from there to education. And one of the big attacks we're seeing right now is specifically on Christian institutions, on Christian colleges, on high schools, K through 12, where they're being told, all right, if you want accreditation or if you want to receive state grants and funding, you must agree to adopt certain policies as it relates to this. So, for example, within the past couple of years, California had a law, was it SB 1142, I believe, that they were trying to enact that would require every college in the state that receives any state grants or funding to adopt those types of non-discrimination policies. Now, you look at a Catholic school, a Protestant school, whatever, that they have certain codes of conduct and says, well, look, as part of attending our school, we adopt and embrace a biblical view of sexuality, and therefore any sexual activity outside of marriage between a man and a woman is forbidden. And that's part of the code of conduct. It's part of what we teach here. And so if you come to our school, you know what you're getting, right? And the state of California was trying to say, well, no, you can't have that policy anymore. And if you want to continue to receive grants, and if your students want to continue to receive state scholarships to attend your school, you've got to abandon those policies. And so the very institutions that we set up to teach the values to the next generation, right? And to say, hey, you can combine your faith and your calling. If you want to be a Christian psychiatrist, if you want to be a Christian attorney, a Christian doctor, Christian whatever, you can do that here. And we're going to help teach you how your faith impacts everything you do. Well, the state of California was saying, no, we're going to ask you to leave that at the door because we don't want you teaching that value to your kids. We have other values, ideologies that we want you to embrace. And so we're seeing these attacks even on those sort of institutions that were set up specifically to keep our faith going. But we know what the ultimate target in all of this is. It's not culture. It's not even our professions, not our educational institutions. It's ultimately the church itself. Is the eventual idea that we are going to force churches to embrace and celebrate this gender identity and sexual orientation ideology. And this is not just sort of, oh, yeah, you're one of those crazy right-wing attorneys. Of course, you're going to be up here saying that. No, we've actually seen this happen in both Massachusetts and Iowa, where the state civil rights commissions, the very institutions set up to enforce those non-discrimination laws, started saying, oh, by the way, churches, you're subject to these as well. So in one instance, I believe it was in Massachusetts, they said, well, if your church has a spaghetti dinner that's open to the public, you are now a public accommodation and therefore are subject to our state's gender identity law. And so therefore, if a man walks into your church and claims to be a female, you must treat him as such and allow him to use your female restrooms and go on ladies' retreats and other activities like that. To which the church says, no, that's in direct opposition. We teach a biblical view of Genesis 1, that God created them male and female, that those are not sort of interchangeable. And so for you to tell us, church, that we preach one thing from the pulpit, but then practice a completely different thing by order of the state is problematic. But this is the view that the states were taking and trying to enforce these laws. And this is ultimately what this battle is about. And this is why I say, and I love speaking at conferences like this, because a lot of times those of us in the various professions say, look, the church is safe, even our schools are safe. Why do we really need to take a stand on this? Let's just compromise a little bit. But I really want to challenge you all in thinking through this. You are on the front lines right now. There are attacks going on with sort of education in the church, undoubtedly, but the primary place of attack right now is on you and the licensed professions. And when you take a stand, and when you say, we will not bow down to this ideology, we will take a stand for our rights, and we will take a stand for the freedom to operate consistent with our conscience, you are taking a stand for everybody that stands behind you. And so if you graduated from a religious college, if you as a licensed professional have the right to operate consistent with your conscience, so too does the educational institution you went to. And so too does your place of worship on Sunday morning. Because if you have the right, and so do the educational institutions, and so do the churches. And this is ultimately part of the battle to go back and redeem our culture and to bring it back to some sanity on these ideas. So I want to encourage you, as we're talking through all of this, I hope you don't just think abstractly like, well, this is great legal stuff, and we'll take it and we'll put it in our pocket. I would challenge you that God has placed you in a particular place at a particular time to take a stand for the gospel and to be able to stand for the freedom that so many men and women have fought and died for over the years, to be able to live out our faith and our conscience. And I say this as somebody that not just, that I'm personally invested in this because of my work and because of my profession, but I've got a grandpa that fought in World War II, passed away a few years ago. But one of his conscience things, he said, look, I don't feel comfortable carrying a gun. He said, I just don't think I can kill somebody. He said, but I want to serve. And so he said, I can be a mechanic. So put me out there. I'll work on the tanks. I'll work on the supply trucks, do whatever. I want to do my part, but I just don't want to carry a gun. And we respected that. But we're losing that as a nation. And we're losing the idea that people should always have the freedom to listen to their conscience first and foremost. And the government has no role in telling someone otherwise. And these are the battles we must continue to fight. They're no longer about sort of conscientious objectors to war. They're about conscientious objectors to the sexual orientation and gender ideology that's being pushed. I like a quote that Justice Alito, when the Obergefell case came down a few years ago, creating this new right to same-sex marriage, he was very sort of prophetic and looking at what's going on. And this was just 2 years ago. And just listen to his words and see if we have not seen this come to pass since that decision came down. I assume that those who cling to the old beliefs will be able to whisper their thoughts in the recesses of their homes. But if they repeat those views in public, they will risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by governments, employers, and schools. Are we not seeing that borne out? Right? Everybody remember, and and I think it's been like a year and a half, which is, in our current time seems like eons ago. But Brandon Ike, the founder and leader of, was it Mozilla or one of the tech firms? And it had come out that you donated to support the battle to defend marriage in California. How dare you do such a thing? And they ran him out of town. Lost his job, lost everything. He's not the first, and he will not be the last of individuals who are kicked out of their profession, labeled as bigots, simply because they took a stand for the millennial-old belief that marriage is between one man and one woman. And we're starting to see this other context, right? I mean, to take a stand on these values really does risk you being labeled as bigots. Now entire states are. If you try and pass a law that protects privacy or protects religious liberty, the entire state of North Carolina is bigoted and Texas is bigoted. And all of these states now, right now, Kansas is trying to pass an adoption agency protection law that preserves the freedom of faith-based agencies to operate consistent with their beliefs. And now the whole state is being labeled, they're anti-LGBT and all of this stuff simply because they're saying, no, we actually want more choices for children looking for forever homes. We want more providers out there finding families and training them to be adoptive parents and foster parents. But to take a stand on any of these issues, to do anything other than whisper them in your homes, gets you labeled a bigot. I want to talk about one other battle that's going on, one that I've been very involved in over the past couple months, and one that I think is very close to you guys, is dealing with these counseling goal bans. So we're seeing these pop up in several states. I think about 10 or so have passed these laws already, dealing specifically with any efforts. They call them, conversion therapy bans or sexual orientation change efforts or things like that. But they're all premised upon this idea that anything you do as a counselor, as a therapist, that helps someone change behaviors or attractions related to sexual orientation, gender identity is banned, right? So these have popped up primarily in regards to minors. And so I know California and New Jersey and a few other states have them that say, as a licensed counselor, licensed therapist, you cannot assist a minor in seeking to change their sexual orientation and gender identity. And to do so subjects you to loss of your professional license. There were some challenges to these laws, both in California and New Jersey, and unfortunately didn't go well. And the court took I think, a very wrong view, but essentially said, because you are a profession, you are entitled to less First Amendment protection for your speech. So the court said, it's one thing to, what you say on your own time, what you say, in your church or whatever, but when you check into work in the morning and you sit into your chair and start your counseling sessions, you lose a measure of First Amendment protection. Now, that's really problematic to me because I read the First Amendment and I don't see sort of like an exception, right? It's like, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or the freedom of speech or of press or things like that. There's not like a, asterisk that then says, except for licensed professionals, right? It's not that you check your First Amendment freedoms at the door when you go into work. Just the opposite. There's something we carry with us everywhere. But unfortunately, the courts are taking a very narrow view of your freedom to speak and your freedom to operate consistent with your religious beliefs, but more importantly, the client's freedom to set their own goals and values and objectives. Because you all know, and this is, sort of counseling ethics 101, you don't set the client's goals. It is extremely unethical to do so. Same thing for my profession. I don't get to tell the clients that walk into our firm, this is what you must sue on. Rather, they come to me, right? They come to me as an attorney and say, this is my problem. I need you to help with it, right? And it's the exact same thing for those of you in the counseling profession. The client walks in and says, this is my problem. This is what I need help with. And then you have a choice to either say, yes, I can help you with that, or no, that's outside of my area of expertise. Let me refer you to someone else. But what these laws are saying is that if someone now walks in and says, I'm struggling with these same-sex attractions, but my faith says I should seek to reduce those or live a chaste life or something like that, you as a counselor have to say, I would like to help you, but I can't. I am outlawed from doing so in the state of California or the state of New Jersey or wherever you may particularly live. Now, so far, those have just been limited to minors. And the whole premise, and again, I reject this premise, I think it's false, is that, well, these parents are dragging their kids in there, kicking and screaming, and you're basically hooking up, electrodes to them and shocking the gay out of them. I mean, if you read the testimony, that is what this idea is. They're subjecting these kids to ice baths and all of these other very unethical, aversive techniques and practices to, shock the gay out of them. I mean, that's honestly how they present these. Now, again, I reject that because, one, that just doesn't happen. I'm not saying it has never happened in the history of our country, and there have been a couple of bad actors. But as a whole, and you guys know this, what do? Someone walks in, and a parent walks in with a child that's, dealing with confusion over their gender identity. You talk with them. You see what's going on. And we've worked with several of the individuals that do this, and they say, this is, the same counseling we do for anybody. And they say a lot of times there may be root causes. There may have been a history of sexual abuse. And they say, we don't really care about the sexual orientation issue. If we look at the sexual abuse and we try and help them cope with that, a lot of times all of the other stuff goes away as well. That's not a problem. It's just a symptom of some underlying issues. Other ones may be, relationship issues or things like that. But what these laws say is you can't help people like that. If this has any impact of changing their behaviors related to their sexual orientation or gender identity, you can lose your license for it. I wish that was where these laws were ending, though, but they're not, because there's now a new breed of these laws popping up. Let me give an example. So this is a law that is working its way through the California legislature right now. Let me ask, anybody here from California by chance? No, okay. I wish you were, because I need some plaintiffs. No, I'm kidding. So California right now this will come to your state, trust me, is working on a new expansion of this. And so the law, essentially, it bans any practices that seek to change behaviors or gender expressions or to eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attractions or feelings towards individuals of the same sex. And it elevates these practices to consumer fraud. And so the theory of this is it is fraudulent for you as a counselor to help someone that's seeking to change or reduce behaviors. This is not limited to minors. This applies to adults. So if a 45-year-old woman, a married mother of three, walks into your clinic and says, I don't know what's going on. I've started experiencing some attractions to a good friend of mine at church. But I don't want to mess up my marriage. I love my husband and I love my kids, and I recognize this is probably not healthy for me, my family, and my faith, again, counsels me otherwise. You must look that 45-year-old woman in the eye and say, sorry, I cannot help you. It is fraudulent for me to do so. One other thing with this law, this is no longer limited to licensed professionals. This applies to everyone in the state of California. So an unlicensed pastor who offers counseling for a fee. Now, the one thing they do is they're still trying to be smart. They're saying, well, it's only for fee-based counseling and services, right? But again, if you're a pastor and say, all right, I counsel my flock, but if you need some additional counseling, I charge a modest fee. And some people may do it just so that there's sort of a sense of commitment, right? So if you're paying like $25 a session, you're not going to blow the sessions off. Or there's large networks of pastoral counselors that say, look, we want to make our services available to those in the community. If you charge a fee, even if you are unlicensed and you're not even saying, look, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not anything, I'm just offering counseling based upon what I've learned, based upon biblical principles, you are subject to this law. If you held a conference, like let's say you held a church marriage conference and people paid a fee, couples paid a fee to attend that marriage conference, and at that conference, you advocated biblical views of sexuality, and you said at that conference, if any of you are struggling maybe with same-sex attractions, we can help you overcome those. We can help you live consistent with your faith and love your spouse better. You would be in violation of this law as a fraudulent practice in violation of the California law. This goes beyond counseling to resources. Again, the word practices is part of a broader description of any goods or services. So if you as a counselor said, hey, there's a great book I would recommend that could help you deal with some of these feelings, and you said they've got them at your local Barnes & Noble or a Christian bookseller or something like that, those books would be outlawed because they are a good or service, and you are recommending that to help them address attractions or feelings or things like that. We've even looked at, with religious schools and colleges, how many of them have a counselor on staff that is part of paying tuition to attend that school? You have access to a counselor, or perhaps there are courses where they teach the biblical view of gender identity and sexual orientation and say, look, the Bible clearly says those are unnatural and sort of God's created scheme of things. And, here at the school, we obviously teach a biblical view. And so we are telling you as part of coming here, you can't act consistent with that. If you have same-sex attractions, you can't act on those. Well, now you're telling students they have to change their behavior, and there's a fee involved, and you would be in violation of this law. And so we're seeing these efforts. Ultimately, to me, I view this is an attack on the core of what the gospel stands for. Because if the gospel is anything, it is that the belief that people can change, right? That we are not bound by this sinful nature, but that through the power of Christ and his death and resurrection, that we can change, to be born again, right? And California is essentially saying, no, you can't. And to say otherwise, to say that change is possible, is fraudulent. And the sad part is we're seeing so many stories coming out of individuals that have experienced such change. We've been working with several that have actually testified and said, look, I came out of a gay lifestyle. And one gentleman, Ken Williams, who now helps individuals dealing with this, and he said, I've been married for 12 years. I have 3 kids and a beautiful wife. How are you telling me that what I experienced is fraudulent? He says, I used to be attracted to men, and I'm not anymore. He said, I've changed. And you're telling me I can't tell that and help other people that are seeking that exact thing? But that's exactly what these laws are attempting to do, is undermine the ability of individuals to seek that change. And so I view it's not just an attack on you as counselors. It's not even an attack on pastoral counselors, but it's ultimately telling the people of California change is not possible and denying them the ability to set their own counseling goals and their own objectives. I want to talk a little bit about the legal profession, some of the stuff that's popped up in Julia case and others, to say I still believe that there is hope in this battle. Number one, these types of policies and these types of laws that are being pushed, these all violate the First Amendment. You as a counselor have freedom of speech. You as a counselor have freedom to exercise your religion, including when you're on the clock, including when you are practicing your profession. And you should not have to check those at the door. What we want to ensure is that when you speak, you do so only if you want to speak, that you are not compelled by the government or by even some of these policies to engage in speech that conflicts with that conflicts with your views about all of this stuff. But we also want to talk about the freedom to exercise, that you've got the freedom to exercise your religion through your practice. And so those are a lot of the arguments that were very successful in Julia's case. The other thing that we're seeing is legal protections through the law. So not just through our First Amendment, our constitutional rights, but even through these, a lot of laws that are starting to pop up. A lot of states, I think 20 to 25, have religious freedom restoration acts. And these laws are all based on the idea that the government can't force you to do something that conflicts with your religious belief, that can't burden your religious beliefs, your religious practice, unless they've got a really compelling interest to do so. So, for example, if you had a religious belief that says, I need to, sacrifice children to appease my God, the government can say, well, that may be your religious belief, but we've got a compelling interest in you not murdering children. So the government wins, right, in that circumstance. But in a situation like Julia's that says, I've got a compelling or a religious belief that I can't affirm certain sexual behaviors, and that person can find counseling that will help them, the government doesn't really seem to have a compelling interest in forcing Julia to affirm something she disagrees with. Because it's not like this person is now forever denied counseling. In fact, there are thousands of other individuals that would gladly provide them the counseling services they need. So the government, in that situation, has no compelling interest, so Julia should win. And that's one of the things we like about these laws, is they do provide some balance. That they recognize that, look, there are certain limits, even on free exercise, if it involves murdering or doing something else that the state has a strong interest in. And then in those situations, the government should win. But there's one of my favorite one of these cases, and it's a little bit outside of the context, but it actually dealt with a Native American individual. And part of his religious practice, they did these very elaborate dances as part of their Native American faith. Well, they required eagle feathers as a very important part of all of this. You may not know it, but it is actually illegal to collect eagle feathers. You can't even, if you see one falling on the ground, you can't pick it up. And it is a federal crime to do so. And it's obviously, sort of protecting eagles and our national bird and things like that. Well, this individual said, look, I don't want to go kill eagles, but if I walk past the nest, why should I be able to pick them up in order to continue with my faith tradition? And the court said, you're right. We do have a compelling interest in protecting eagles, but if all you're trying to do is pick up a few that are seated on the ground and your religion compels this, you ought to win. And I agree with that outcome. And that just shows why these types of religious freedom laws, I think, are very good and striking a good balance of ensuring that there is breathing room for religion, even in the face of laws that may have good intents, like protecting eagles, but can get taken to extremes sometimes. One other type of law that we're starting to see pop up, actually grew up in Tennessee, so I can proudly say this, is actually laws specifically designed to protect counselors. And so I think it was last year, Tennessee passed the first in the nation law that specifically ensures the freedom of counselors to operate consistent with their religious beliefs. Huge law, very important to you guys. And despite sort of fears of Armageddon happening and, people everywhere across Tennessee are going to be denied counseling, nothing has happened. Which is exactly right, because this has been the practice for hundreds of years in the counseling profession. You operate consistent with your beliefs and you can refer. And Tennessee just set it up and said, well, we're going to make that official law now so that there's some protections for counselors. And life has moved on. And to me, that shows why these laws are so helpful and important, is that they don't result in sort of the terrible stories that the other side likes to push. But these are very straightforward, simple laws that just ensure that freedom of conscience is protected.
Someone who's used media a lot in evangelization, so I believe in the importance of Catholic radio, Catholic TV, Catholics using the new media. And I encourage everyone to watch Shalom TV. I think it's a great vehicle of evangelization. And God bless all of you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.